Good morning, guys. Okay, we have a lecture today over industrialization. So basically what we have is we have the end of the Western frontier. Remember barbed wire and the laying of track for the railroad to be able to reach coast to coast have basically caused an end to the frontier. So the Indian Wars are coming to an end. The Native Americans are being placed on reservations. We have settlers that are continuously moving westward into those territories. And so everything's changing, and the frontier is about to close. And at the same time, and this is something that you have to understand about history, even though you can put these things on a timeline, not everything is sequential. So sometimes there's an overlap. So this is going to be our overlap. So we're going to have industrialization kind of overlapping with the end of the Western frontier. All right. So as the Western frontier is being settled in our cities, we have the industrialization process going on. All right. So on your screen there, it shows you the industrialization 1865 being the end of the Civil War, all the way up into 1901. You can see with the photograph that's in the middle of your screen what New York City would have looked like in 1900. Very crowded, lots of immigrants, lots of workers. You can see to the left, even a lot of our workers were children. So there was a lot of child labor that was going on. There was no compulsory school. So children were able to work as young as you could get them into a factory. And more factories began to develop from 1865 through the 1900s, right? So we are going to go ahead and start with American industrializing. American industrialization proceeded at a rapid pace in the decades after the Civil War. So what happens, guys, is once the Civil War ends, you have the destruction of the economy in the South. But in the East, the Northeast, those cities are beginning to boom. Mainly because they're working to provide for the soldiers during the Civil War. And a lot of those industries, a lot of those businesses would get paid mainly by the government during the Civil War for products for the war itself, but they didn't have a place to spend that money. So many of them held on to that money throughout the Civil War. But then once the Civil War is over, now you start to see more production, more expansion as more and more businesses begin to expand more and more. So more of them start building their factories. They start investing. They start, building more buildings for their factories or their manufacturing areas or storage or whatever it may be. And so we start to see more and more growth within the cities themselves. And so some called this America's second industrial revolution because you really started to see a spike in the growth of our cities. Okay. Now, because of that, we had a lot of new technology. So this is what we call our technological innovations. Your innovations just means that it's new inventions, new technologies that people are starting to develop and use throughout the country. And so some of these new inventions and technologies began to help fuel the economic expansion of the late 19th century, right? So you started to see steam and electricity replacing human and animal strength. In other words, you started seeing machines that were using steam and electricity replace having to have a human do it physically or an animal do it physically. You could use some type of machine that had either steam or electricity that was the fuel for that machine, right? We started to see wood being replaced by iron. So steel began to replace iron. There's a huge development in what we call the Bessemer process. Now, this is underlined in your notes for a reason. This is something that when we talk about the industrialization period, the Bessemer process is a big part of that because it allows for us to start using steel over iron. So the Bessemer process is a big step, a big technological step in the process of our expansion. So circle it, highlight it, put a star next to it, but the Bessemer process is a big deal, all right? So all it's going to do is it made production of steel more economical. So it's not that we didn't know how to use steel before the Bessemer process, but the idea of having to make that steel into something that was manufacturable was not something that we were capable of. So the Bessemer process makes the production of it more economical. So now it's cheaper to make. And so since it's cheaper to make, more people can use it because more people can now afford it, all right? And so you started to see more and more things built with steel and less things built out of iron. And so that was something that helped in our expansion because this allowed us to build differently and to build more and to build larger, right? Steam is also a big change. We've used steam to power our textile mill equipment. And so as the textile mills became more and more important, remember your textile mills, that's where they are developing different types of clothing and material, right? So in the textile industry, that's your clothing industry. They're the ones taking the natural resources like cotton and making them into like a shirt or a pair of pants, something like that. So the textile industry is extremely important and is booming in places like New York City in the 19th century. So to have steam being used instead of the burning coal, that was something that was useful, right? The coal was a natural resource that came from places like Pennsylvania. It had to be shipped in. With the steam, you could use this steam to heat your water and use that in the process of making your textiles. And so it was a little cleaner. The steam was a little bit cleaner than the coal. And so it was a step forward in the technology of our powering our textile mills and some other types of mills. We also have, by the late 19th century, we're going to see our first oil well drilled in the state of Pennsylvania in 1859. Okay, now I know that a lot of people don't associate Pennsylvania with the oil industry, but they're actually still a big part of the oil industry. So we have our first oil well drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859. That's a big deal because that means that we're going to be able to start using this resource to power things that we haven't been able to power in the past. So you see, because we have the ability now to use oil and gas, now you start to see the development of the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine used gasoline. And since it uses gasoline from the oil that we've discovered, now we can create things like cars and airplanes, right? So before 1859 and the discovery of oil, cars and airplanes, the combustion engine is not something people are really thinking about because you don't have the necessary resource to run it. But since we have now oil, and therefore because of oil we have gasoline, now we have the internal combustion engine, and the internal combustion engine can now lead to other innovations like the car and the airplane. So you can see how they're all connected. So once one technology is developed, it helps in the creation of another technology. And that leads to the development of another type of technology. And so you can see that it's all connected to one another. So once we started these innovations, life began to change pretty drastically for the American people throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. So there's a lot going on for Americans during this time period, because you have to think, you have in 1859, the Civil War hasn't even started. Okay, so from 1859 forward, you're going to have the Civil War. You're going to have the settling of the Western frontier, which all of that includes, remember, all the Indian Wars and all of the gold rushes and all that. And you're also going to start to see the cities begin to boom. And all of this is going to take place between 1859 and the early 1900s. So that's a big, big change in a considerably short period of time when you look at history. So Americans are going through a lot of changes by the end of the 19th century. It's exciting at the same time that you see people that are not sure about all of this new technology. But America is moving forward, and we're expanding economically, we're expanding as a country, literally, geographically. And so there's a lot of things that are happening for America throughout this time period. All right. And remember, this is like overlapping some of this information. Now, some of the innovations that we're going to see, like we said, the Bessemer project process was huge. If you want to get into the science of the Bessemer project, you could probably get some pretty good information from your science teacher about it. We're just going to let you know that it's a new process. It's a new innovation that changes the way we can use the technology of steel, or the use of steel. Now, some other things that we're going to see, for the first time, we're going to see the commercial use of electricity, right? So electricity's been around for a long time, but it's never been used commercially. And so the commercial use of electricity is going to be used as a means of communication. In other words, we're going to create these telegraph wires that are going to connect towns to one another, right? Now, the cities are using the telegraphs, but you really see the telegraphs used out in the West, in the Western frontier, in an attempt to connect these smaller towns to the larger towns, and in effect, connect us to the East, right? And that way you can get information back and forth a little bit quicker. When we talked about the Indian Wars, the fact that the Native Americans figured out that these telegraph lines that were running across these telegraph poles, and the poles, guys, look just like the wooden telephone poles that you see today, that strings that cord across there. And so these electricity lines, these telegraph lines are running, and of course it's run on electricity, and it uses what we call Morse code. So the telegraph lines are going to use Morse code, and you tap in a code, and then the reader, the person on the other end of that line, is going to listen to the code as it comes in. It taps in, and as it taps in, they decipher the code, and then they can give the message to the person that it came for. And so the telegraph wires were a way for us to be able to communicate with one another. By 1876, those things are changing. So we're innovating. We're making them better. So we're going to move from the telegraph line and telegraph wires and Morse code to Alexander Graham's Bell invention of the telephone. And so once we have the telephone, now people can actually pick up their phone, and they can get information. They can tell the operator their information, and another phone will ring at the other end. Okay, so if you'll look at your screen here, you can see right here at the bottom, this phone right here. If you notice on this little black phone at the bottom of your screen, there's no dial, there's no numbers, because what you're going to do is you're going to pick up the headphone on the side. You pick it up, and when you pick it up, it clicks. And so you put that to your ear, and you put this little thing right here, you put this up to your mouth, and you speak into it. When you picked it up and it clicked, it told an operator that you were on the line. So the operator will come on and ask you who you're trying to call, and you tell them you're calling number 21. And they would, on their big board, they would connect you to phone number 21. And then that phone would ring, and then that person would pick up, and you would be able to talk to them. So you had to go through the operator. There was no dialing that would happen on those first phones. And this phone that you see, this is not even this is an early phone, but they had those that were even bigger than those. They used to be a giant box. It was a huge brown box that had the phone connected to it. and you would just pick it up and talk into the speaker like you see there. And then from the box, they made them smaller as to the one that you see on your screen right there. All right. Then by 1879, Thomas Edison will produce our first effective electric light bulb. Okay, so the electric light bulb is going to be developed by Thomas Edison. Now, the reason that Thomas Edison gets credit for the light bulb, I know that you've heard that there's different people from around the world. There's those that in Europe that claim that they believe that somebody else is the one that produced it. There were light bulbs prior to Edison. There were other inventors and entrepreneurs that were working on this same idea, but Edison is the one that's going to create the one that lasts. So his light bulb is effective. In other words, you can actually use it. So there's other people that are working on this idea, but he's the one that perfects it. He's the one that makes it usable. And so he's the one that produces our first effective electric light bulb. Now, the light bulb is important, guys, because of electricity and the use of these light bulbs, now what we have are cities and towns that can use this electricity to power machinery. With the light bulb, obviously, there's light after dark. Remember, most people woke up with the sun and they went to bed with the sun. And so you did that. Only that time period of the day where the sun was out was where you were being productive, where there was work being done. But now what we're going to see with electricity and light bulbs, now what happens is I can light things up. So I can have people stay in longer. They can work on days even when the sun's not out. I can have them work earlier. I can have people work later, right? So it changes how we're going to do things, even in our manufacturing industry, because it changes how many hours people are up and how many hours people are working. And so the electricity and the light bulb makes a huge change in the amount of hours that we spend in a day actually up and about, all right, and working for that matter, right? By 1900, we're also going to see electricity change transportation. We're going to see electric streetcars. So you can see it down in the right-hand corner of your screen there. This is one of the electric streetcars. You can see right here, this little pole is connecting to a line that's connecting them to the electricity that allows them to move. And those electric streetcars were used in a lot of your large cities. Today, you can still see these in places like San Francisco, right? And then another thing that's going to be established by 1900 because of electricity are subway trains. And so this obviously are in places like New York, Chicago, these subway systems that are established as early as the 1900s, these subway trains. And electricity is the reason that you have that type of transportation. Remember, the subways are underneath the ground that are used, okay? And all these inventions literally change things. And it's important to understand you have to understand that without these innovations, we don't have the things that we're using today. I wouldn't be able to do this for you today without these inventions. So if there's no electricity, I don't have a laptop. Okay? If there's no electricity, you don't have the invention of a battery that can be put into your phone that you can use all day long. All right? If you don't have these innovations, you don't have your phone, okay? So you can look at the timeline at the bottom of the screen there. You can see the evolution of your telephone. So we have our first telephone in 1876. Like we said, it's a big box that you would have to mount up on a wall. It doesn't go anywhere. You have to stand right there with it. Then you have the dial phone. Okay, so instead of having to talk directly to an operator, you could pick it up and dial. It's called a rotary dial, and you can dial the numbers, okay, for the phone number. By 1920, we have phone boxes. We call them phone booths here in the United States. But you could go in and do the same thing. You had a big box that was in there, and you could make a phone call. Remember, no cell phones. Okay? Then in 1960s, we have the push button phone. Okay, so that's a big change from the rotary the rotary phone. So now you just push your numbers in instead of having to do the Rolodex, right? You have the space saver phone by the mid-1960s. In other words, phones were becoming smaller. In the 70s, we have cordless phones. By the 1990s, we see the first mobile phones. Okay, so these are the first, what you would call a cell phone. They were called mobile phones. They were big and bulky. They took up a lot of room, but they were mobile. You weren't tied. There wasn't a cord that tied you somewhere, right? And then by the 1990s, you see what's a little bit more familiar to you in regards to cell phones. And by 2011, we have the smartphone. And remember, the smartphone is more of a small computer that we hold in our hand. Without Alexander Graham Bell, there is no cell phone in 2020, right? So, these are not innovations that don't mean anything. These are innovations that are important to the development of new technologies. Each new innovation raises our standard of living. It helps our national economy, right? So as you see these innovations, understand that it's changing people's lives, right? It changes how people do things. Just think of it as if there were no cell phones, and then you were able to, within your lifetime, hold that cell phone in your hand and use it for all the things that you have. That's how important these innovations are to these individuals in our history. And because of these innovations, our economy gets stronger, because these are innovations that people are going to buy. And these are innovations, guys, that we are going to send worldwide. So other countries are going to be affected by the things that are being created in the United States. Okay? All right. Some other important innovations that we want you guys to kind of look at. You have the sewing machine in 1846. Okay, now that's a big deal, because think about your textile industry, how important that is. Everything was done by hand, so you had to sew everything by hand. But then with the sewing machine invention, now these workers have the ability to use this machine to move faster, to make things faster, and to be able to sell more. So again, that sewing machine is helping the economy, right? And then with Elijah Otis in 1852, the passenger elevator. The first passenger elevator is over here on your right-hand side that you see. It's very similar to still the way the elevators are used today. This is an important innovation because it means that we can build our buildings taller. So, usually you would only have maybe 3 to 5 stories, but with the passenger elevator, now I can build buildings a lot higher. Now, remember, at the same time, we have the innovations of steel and the Bessemer process of changing things about the building materials that we are able to use. So if we want to build up higher, then people aren't going to want to walk 10 stories, but they will get businesses and apartments and things like that up on higher stories if you have these passenger elevators. All right, so this is a big change in allowing us to build upward instead of always outward. Right, and that's a big deal for landlocked cities where you have only so much space available, like New York. It's landlocked, right? It's sitting right next to the ocean. So there's only so much it can expand outward. There's only so much it can go outward. It has to go upward. And so this type of an invention helps you to go upward, right? And then 1867, Christopher Scholl's typewriter. Again, it makes things so much easier and able to do things. Everything doesn't have to be written by hand. You can have people type things out. And so it just made life a little bit easier. Again, improving our standard of living. And then, like we said, Alexander Graham Bell's 1876, then the telephone. You can see over on the right-hand side, this is one of the very first telephone, the idea of recording your voice, that type of thing. And then Edison's electric light bulb in 1879. And then a huge one in the early 20th century is the 1903 Orville and Wilbur Wright airplane. So the Wright brothers are going to fly an airplane in 1903. Again, there's other people that were working on the same thing, but the Wright brothers are the ones that are able to get it up in the air and the ones that are able to get it to sustain itself in the air for a longer period of time. So they are able to actually fly the airplane. And so they are going to get credit for the invention of the airplane with the Wright brothers. Now, again, that's huge. It's a combustible engine, all right? It's using the new innovations of the time with the engine, the oil, the gasoline, the new mechanisms that they're using to allow for an airplane to be up in the air, right? And the airplane is going to be a huge invention because it captures the imagination of the American people. And this idea that we could actually fly, and this idea that we could eventually turns into the flying that we do today, passenger flight, where we actually have airlines that can do this. So it just captures the imagination of the American people being in the air. And so that's what you're seeing with a lot of these innovations is what can we do next with this innovation, right? And so it leads to more innovation, more invention. And remember, guys, these are what we call our entrepreneurs. These are the folks that are taking the risk to develop and grow something. And they're the ones that are putting their money into it. And if it works, they're going to make a lot of money. If it doesn't work, they're going to lose what they've invested. So you have to keep in mind that all of these names that you see on your screen here, these are all our entrepreneurs. These are part of entrepreneurship that's allowed to happen in a free enterprise system. Without the free enterprise system, without the entrepreneurs, our economy would not have continued to develop, right? So this is something that you want to track and trace all the way back to Alexis de Tocqueville's idea that you had people that were allowed to have the freedom to create these things, right? So without the type of system that America has, these things don't happen. One of the reasons that these things happen in America is because we do have the type of system that we have. We have the free enterprise system. We had the freedom to invest. They are allowed to be entrepreneurs. The government's not telling them what they have to do. They're setting out on their own. They're investing on their own. They're creating on their own. And in other, like a country under communism, so for example, they don't have this type of thing because the government's telling them everything they have to do every single day. All right. So these entrepreneurs are changing the way America works, literally how we work. Okay. Of course, the big one, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked about our Western expansion and the settling of the West, is the railroad. The railroads are instrumental in the development of our industry in the East, and they're also instrumental in connecting those Eastern industries with the Western frontier. So if we don't have the railroads, the industries in the East do not have the natural resources that they need, right? So the big one is the Transcontinental Railroad. Again, circle it, highlight it. You have to know what the Transcontinental Railroad is. Remember, the Transcontinental Railroad has two separate crews working. You have one crew that's starting from California, and they're laying track, and they're moving eastward. And from the middle of our country, we have them moving westward, right? So there's two different crews that are moving towards each other. And then they're going to cut through the high mountains of the Sierra Nevada. And then in 1869, they connect with one another at Promontory Point, Utah. Now, you saw the video where you saw the Golden Spike. Remember the Golden Spike video from your last unit? That's what they're talking about. That's Promontory Point, Utah. That's where they connected with one another, had the big ceremony, drove in the Golden Spike to connect East and West, right? Now, this connection, the Transcontinental Railroad, means that The journey from coast to coast is reduced from several months to several weeks. So I can go from New York City all the way to California on a train, right, for the first time with the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is a huge deal. The railroads are also the industry that connects our country. They're the ones that are going to allow our economy to become a national economy. In other words, we're not just split up into a whole bunch of different regions. Now we have a national economy that is spread across the entire country that's connected to each other, right? So the telephone, electricity, railroads, all of those things are allowing our nation to connect to one another instead of being like separate territories and separate regions, okay? So let's look at the development of our national market. So in the late 19th century, we now have a true national market, right? So that means that we are actually connected. So some of the things that when you look at what connects us economically, the railroads, the canals that are being built, the telegraphs, the telephones, electricity, all of those innovations that we've been talking about, those things are linking us together, right? Instead of being a whole bunch of different parts, now we're connected as one part. We're one nation economically, right? So one of the things that we're seeing is the shipping of our raw materials. That's where your railroad comes in. The raw materials that we're finding in the western area of our country, we're able to get those raw materials, put them on trains, and ship them back to our industries, our factories that are located in the east, like New York City. And so we can send them back to those big cities, and that's where all the manufacturing is. So we have the big, giant factories and the textile industry and those types of things that are located in the east. So we send those raw materials to the east. The east takes those raw materials and makes some type of good, a finished good, whether it's a shirt, a pair of shoes, whether it's, like eventually things like furniture, telephones, anything like that, they can build them. They use the raw materials to build these finished goods, and then they ship them back to the West and it's less expensive, right? And so if it's less expensive to make my product, I can sell it at a cheaper price. And so since it's less expensive to get those raw materials now to the cities can create a finished product or a finished good, and now they can sell it in the West at a less expensive price. And when it drops in price, it means you have access. More people have access to it if it's less expensive. If it's expensive, and let's say, yeah, you could sell it to the wealthiest of the wealthy in your country, but there's only so many of those folks. That's a small percentage of the population. You want to be able to sell something that the majority of your population can purchase. If the majority can purchase it, you're going to make a lot more money. So this is good for the industries. They're able to continue to grow and develop because the raw materials that are coming in are coming in a cheaper fashion because they're coming in on the railways. And so you had these huge factories that have all of these new products that they want to sell. Now, once they have the products, they know that they have to sell them out west, not just in the city. So how do I get my product back out to the West, and how do I ship it out there without shipping too much of my product? So new methods of selling developed. So you started to see a change in the way we sold things to one another. One of the things that you see is, especially in the cities, are department stores and chain stores. Department stores, those were big stores. They had the big marble entrance. They were more expensive usually. And your department stores where those that had a little bit more money would shop, right? So those would be your department stores. your chain stores, a chain store is a store that looks exactly the same regardless of what city it may be located in. All right, so a Walmart is a chain store. A Sam's is a chain store. Target is a chain store. All right, so they're selling things cheaper at chain stores. And a lot of your chain stores in the early 1900s were things that the stores that were well known were Woolworths. So if you see in the bottom left-hand corner, you see Woolworths. It's called the 5 and 10 cent store. Everything in there was 5 or 10 cents for the most part. These were extremely popular throughout the United States, all the way up into the 1950s, early 60s. You still had some Woolworths that were around in the 1960s. So this was a chain store that most people associated with this early time period, because you could go in, you could get anything from candy to a tea set. I mean, there's pretty much anything that you needed, you could get from a Woolworths, right? So it was kind of a big deal. And we'll talk again about Woolworths in the 1950s civil rights movement, because they also had inside their store, they would have these little areas where you could purchase food, and you would have the ability to go in and eat in these little chain stores. All right, so we'll talk again about them, their little soda fountains, and how they affected the civil rights movement in the 50s. All right, but the Woolworths is these chain stores that are moving across, that are being built across small towns and cities throughout the United States. Another way that they started getting their products to people were through mail order houses. And this is where you see the development of Sears and Roebuck. The Sears and Roebuck catalog would be sent out all across the country, especially into your towns out west, right? And so since the factories were so far away from them, they're not just sending all of their products out there. And so they would send out their product catalog. And so Sears and Roebuck was the big one. And you would go into the store, into your general store, and you would ask for the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And then you would look through the catalog for what you needed. You would tell them what you needed, and then they would order it for you from the factories or from the manufacturing areas of the East. And then the East would get your order. They would put your product on a train and they would send it out to the West. So it might take you a long time to get it, but you could still order it through the catalog. And so Sears and Roebuck became a huge developer of the mail order. So you can see at the picture in the middle, that is one of Sears and Roebuck's plants that was located in Chicago. So look how large that is, that entire plant. It takes up a huge amount of acreage, but this is where they're storing a lot of their products and shipping those products out to the West. And so most of these would be near a railroad. And so they would want them close to a railroad so they could load their products cheaper and get them out as quickly as possible. And so to the right, you can see an actual catalog of a Sears and Roebuck catalog. So from Sears and Roebuck, Sears eventually will become Sears, the Sears store. And then you'll see Sears stores, they were located all across the country. And then a lot of them ended up in like mall areas as part of different malls. And unfortunately, Sears declared bankruptcy. Probably, I guess it's been a couple of years. We're still a couple of them open nationwide, but they did declare bankruptcy. And basically, why are they having to declare bankruptcy? There's too much competition. They can't compete. The big competitor they can't compete with is Amazon. Now, isn't that ironic? Amazon is exactly how Sears and Roebuck started, right? They started through mail order. And so Amazon is the same thing. It just uses the internet instead of a catalog. They use the U.S. mail instead of putting their products on trains. See, so it's the same type of idea that Amazon's using that Sears and Roebuck used in the early 1900s. It's just that Amazon has it a lot easier because of the use of the internet, that new technology, right? And so that in a turn has put Sears out of business, basically. Okay, but this is how we're starting to develop our national market. That's what you need to take from this, is how important it is that our national market has now emerged for the first time. Okay, now some new types of business organizations. Okay, now I know that this is not super exciting, but this is something we have to understand about the economy and what's changing in our country in the late 19th century, early 20th century. All right, so before the Civil War, businesses were owned by individuals or partners. So you started a business, or you started a business with a partner, and you guys ran your business. Now, after the Civil War, things change, because after the Civil War, we're starting to see the increase of all of this new industry. So we start to see what's called a corporate form of business. Now, a corporation is a company that's chartered by the state and recognized in law as a separate person. All right, so a corporation, basically what you have is you have different investors that have invested into that company that now is known as a corporation. That corporation takes on the persona of a person when it has a legal issue. All right, so if you want to sue, you don't sue the person, you sue the corporation, because the corporation is now seen as a person in the eyes of the courts. Okay, and then once you've established a corporation, you issue shares to your investors. Your shares are their stocks, right? So you try to make your shareholder is now a partial owner of that business, right? So your corporation issues your stocks. When I buy a stock, I have now become a partial owner of that corporation. Okay. Now, you have big, huge corporations like Walmart. They're not actually a corporation. They're owned by a corporation. But if you have any kind of legal dealing with them, you deal with Walmart. You don't deal with the person that has the title as CEO of Walmart, right? They don't sue them individually. They sue the corporation, all right? And so if I buy stock in Walmart, I am now a partial owner of Walmart. Now, can I buy a whole lot of stock in Walmart? No, because they don't have a whole lot of stock out there, because their stock has been bought. They don't need new stockholders. They don't need new investors. And so when you buy stock, their stock is extremely high. So you can't buy very much of it. So you're not going to have a say-so in what's happening with their corporation because you own so little stock, all right? What you wanted to do was be able to buy stock in a corporation that wasn't big yet, but you thought was going to be big down the road. So this is what we call speculation. And so what you want to be able to do is buy something early, cheap. You want to buy it cheap, and then have that business or that corporation take off and be extremely successful. And now you own something that's worth a whole lot of money. And you can sell your stock for a whole lot of money if you want to, right? And so that was something that's what we call speculation in the stock market, which is starting to get big during this time period, right? So let's say, for example, you look at this young guy that's developing oil and selling oil. And so you invest in what's called the Standard Oil Trust. Okay, now the Standard Oil Trust is the Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company at one point will be the biggest oil company in the entire nation, and it will own the majority of the oil. It's going to be extremely profitable and extremely powerful. So if you own stock in the Standard Oil Company from an early time when it first started, you're going to make a whole lot of money. And in their instance, you're going to have actually a lot of power. Okay. Same thing with the Ford Motor Company. All right. Think about with the Ford Motor Company, it's a corporation, right? So Ford needs investors. So I buy stock in Ford Motor Company thinking, okay, this is a company that might take off, right? then Ford Motor Company does take off. They start selling their Model Ts and their Model As, and they start making lots and lots and lots of money. Now, the stock that I bought, let's say I bought this stock for 25 cents, okay? My 25-cent stock, when that company is now making lots and lots of money, they're going to ask to buy my stock, and they want to buy it for $5, okay? So I've made a lot of money with just that one stock. But remember, most people buy multiple stocks. So you don't usually buy one. You're going to buy multiple into that corporation, okay? But what this does now is the owners of stock share in profits of the corporation. So when the corporation does good, my stock does good, and I make money from that stock, okay? It makes it possible for people to pool their money together. So you take different people, they've invested their money together instead of just one person saying, I'm going to own this business and start this business all by themselves and invest everything they have into it. Now what they can do is get other people to invest in it, pool that money together, and allow the corporation to grow, right? Hopefully, that's the idea. Now it's possible for companies to raise vast sums of money. So if I'm a company, let's say I'm a manufacturer of something, and I need more equipment to produce more of my product, but I don't have the money to buy that equipment. Now I can become a corporation, which means that I've become public. People can buy into it, they can invest into it, and now we can raise enough money through those investors to buy the equipment that I need, right? Corporations made modern industrial production possible, right? So if it weren't for corporations, the type of industry that we have throughout our big cities would not be possible, right? So these types of new businesses are extremely helpful in the development of our economy, right? So think about this as a time period of innovation. Think of it as a time period of economic growth, as a time period in which we're starting to see entrepreneurs really put forth a huge amount of innovations, and that those innovations are changing the country as a whole, right? And so keep that in mind as we continue to talk about industrialization, and then we'll talk about the downside of it, which is going to be what we call the Gilded Age, and that'll be a connection to this unit, which is the Gilded Age, where we'll talk about how all of these changes are happening, and these are good for the economy, but it may not always be so great for the workers. And so we'll talk about some of the downside to all of this innovation, all this change that's happening economically to America. Okay? All right. So we'll see you guys. All right. I hope, if you, again, always, if you have questions, please ask. All right. Thanks, guys.